This is the Mindful Cranks, and I am your host, Ron Purser. Has the American dream been built on a fundamental delusion that we are all independent and autonomous individuals, that whether we become insanely wealthy or completely broke, simply a matter of choice, that if we wish to be successful, we just need to work hard, put our nose to the grindstone, and pull ourselves up by our own, bootstraps? Bootstrapped, Liberating Ourselves from the American Dream is the title of Alissa Quart's new book, published by Ecco Books, HarperCollins. I was happy to be able to speak with her before taking off on her national book tour, and we cover a lot of ground in this conversation. From looking at the shadowy histories of Horatio Alger, Ayn Rand, and the American icons of self-reliance, including Emerson and Thoreau, to debunking contemporary myths of the self-made man and woman, and examining how this American folk psychology of bootstrapping has fueled many rich fictions that have valorized a heroic independence, thus marginalizing a more social and interdependent understanding of human flourishing and well-being. Alissa points us to a way of embracing our dependence on others, not as something weak or shameful, but as a natural expression of our humanity, offering a more communitarian, a new American dream. Alissa Quart is the author of 4 other acclaimed books, including Squeezed, Republic of Outsiders, Hothouse Kids, and Branded, as well as 2 books of poetry, Thoughts and Prayers, and Monetized. She is the executive director of the nonprofit, the Economic Hardship Reporting Project. She has written for many publications, including The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Time. Her honors include an Emmy, a Society of Professional Journalists Award, and a Neiman Fellowship. She lives with her family in Brooklyn. Alissa Quart, welcome to the Mindful Cranks.
Oh, hi. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about how you met Barbara Ehrenreich, and you really became very close to her. I know there was a tribute you actually wrote for her, and it appeared in Time magazine recently, too.
Yeah, it was kind of surprising. I found it recently. It was in their In Memoriam issue. It's very weird to see it in this context, because it's like, Anne Heche, Barbara, Angela Lansbury. I think she would have appreciated that. So, yeah, I wrote this statement about her partially because I felt like people were not recognizing that she was an activist and an advocate as well. And they kept saying, reporter. Primarily, she was a social critic. I mean, she did go do actual undercover reporting, but she wasn't never worked in a newspaper. She was a magazine writer if she was within journalism. But so I felt like I wanted to get out there into a place like Time, co-chair of the DSA, early feminist, body feminist, just reproductive rights at frontline labor leader. So I just felt like there was this discomfort in places, really mainstream places, to write that she was an activist, because in their cosmology, that's negative. You can't be a journalist and an advocate. I was very inspired to get that out there.
Mm-hmm. And you are now the executive director of the Economic
I've been for a long time. I mean, I've been that title and that role. I've probably had this role for like 9 years, but I've been doing this, basically running it entire, because she was not present for some of the last years of her life. And then before that, I did like all the day-to-day operations, but it was like her vision was guiding everything. I mean, it was.
And that's the Economic Hardship Reporting Project.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into your new book, Bootstrapped, and your first chapter, really quite good. I just thoroughly enjoyed it. Your first chapter opens up with almost like tracing the lineage of the term bootstrapping, that in the very early days of its usage, it wasn't really viewed positively. Is that correct?
Um, well, early days, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps was viewed as a joke. I've been having these conversations where, like, a lot of these terms, including like things like screen time, I think that was originally in
Oh,
Mother
yes.
Jones, and these terms are originated as absurdities or as critiques, and then they get absorbed and naturalized as like great things, or
Yeah.
they mean something totally different. Like the American dream, when it was coined in 1931, was a much more expansive communitarian dream,
Hmm.
which is part of my argument, honestly, that we need to go back to its original meaning. But if we go back to the original meaning of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, it was an impossible absurdity. It was akin to like lying on your back, trying to pull on a pair of skis. Think of how do you, first of all, pulling on your boots was really hard. And that's part of, in the 1830s, men wore boots. We're talking about men mostly. If you're rich, you had someone putting on your boots for you. If you were, I think, quite rich, you had like a machine. They actually had that would help you get your boots on. But if you're poor, you're like working really hard just to get the boots on, right? And then to go that further step where you're actually pulling your entire body up. Everyone understood that was like ridiculous. It was used by like a metaphysician to illustrate the impossibility of doing,
Oh,
doing
God.
something at all. So and then, but I feel like, yeah, America's just riddled with these jokes and these ambiguous phrases that then get normalized and naturalized. The hustle is the latest one, right?
Yeah,
That
these
that we live
cultural
with.
memes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But Reagan seemed to like this term very much, and so does Silicon Valley.
That they love it, and or Horatio Alger story, which is another I'm sure we'll get into
Yeah, we're going to
another
get into
story
that, definitely.
needed to be deconstructed. And I started out as I was in graduate school in literature. I'm one of those English majors, right? But I feel like that's and doing like theory, that these are things that are completely loathed now, like literature and critical theory. But that I feel like it trained me to really look at phrases and
Yeah.
very critically.
Yeah,
Um,
another one is self-made, right? The
yeah, self-made.
oxymoron, and we look
Yeah.
at people like Jeff Bezos, of course, and Elon Musk, even Trump. I hate to say it, but let's get into this historical account of American transcendentalism. That was a real eye-opener for me, just how influential those writers were on our bootstrap psyche.
Yeah, Ron, some of that is that they're the kind of, this is like, I wanted to include a self critique in this, and I can get into that. Like, I didn't want it to just be like, oh, those people who believe in, those people, the right wingers who believe
Right.
in, whatever.
No, this is pervasive culturally.
Right, but the Emerson part is like the liberal part, right? It's like
Yeah.
self-actualization and nonconformity, and how much that actually has in common and is foundational for the more conservative monetistic version. I mean, that's the sort of metaphysical version, or the kind that we would chime to, and then we would find ourselves attacking ourselves. I mean, I would, along the lines like, why am I not more Emersonian, or you know what I mean?
Well, the
Yeah.
hippies were very much into the transcendentalist, and
Mhm.
but you uncovered that they weren't quite as self-reliant as they made themselves out to be, right?
No, I mean,
I
and
never knew any of that.
yeah, I don't mean it
Yeah,
as a gotcha, because I think
yeah. Well, I don't
I mean,
think
it
anything wrong
functions.
with a gotcha there.
I think it functions as a gotcha,
Yeah.
but I mean, I understand, and I'm sure there'll be sort of like lit professors coming out of the woodwork that are like,
Okay.
hey, Emerson means self-reliance in the sense of independent from organized religion. Okay, that's true. At the same time, I look at a lot of these phrases, and there's just no way that you can read them as purely about self-expression or something like that, or like individualism and like nonconformity. They're also really about the necessity of usually a man to survive on their own. Meanwhile, he's getting his he was a widower. He's getting his first wife's estate to help pay for the transcendentalists.
I mean, Emerson was funding him, right? Or
Yep.
mm-hmm,
He was
mm-hmm.
he was doing services. I think he was like a handyman and he's a tutor, but it was still like, yeah, he was like living on the property. I mean, I sort of have less of a bone to pick with Thoreau, even though he was just because he did take some very principled stands. But I
Yeah.
think Emerson sort of wanted it always, and that seems more problematic to me. Yeah.
There's so many of these cultural myths that have shaped us politically, economically, our views, and especially the Horatio Alger stories, which you devote almost an entire chapter to. And I was really taken aback to learn just how influential this man's books were. in American
Yeah.
culture.
I
Going
mean,
back to what, just after the Civil War?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And he was one of those kind of uh, Gilded Age, maybe even a little before, where there was epic inequality. It's a similar moment in some ways. There were all these boys living on the Bowery, and he actually would sort of he picked up some of them, and they lived with him, and he wrote these novels that were all about young men, beautiful young men, usually making it in the city. They have names like Tony the Tramp or Paul the Peddler, and they're really god awful. I mean, he was just, I thought, like not a good writer. But everyone, it was millions of people bought these books. They were translated into like dozens, if not, I don't even know, dozens of languages. And the real, if you do a real close reading, they're not even what we think of Horatio Alger as, like a rags to riches story. And it is, in the sense that these boys make it out of the slums, the Bowery slum kind of setting. But they're almost always helped by an older gentleman of means, or multiple men of means that are usually taken with their strapping good looks. And one of the things biographically, of course, is Horatio Alger. I don't want to say, we don't know if he was always a pedophile, but he had committed acts of pedophilia. Mm-hmm. And was very enchanted by very young men, right? Old boys, or whatever. And that relationship of the elder, wealthier man taking care of the child, the teenager, young man, is not a Horatio Alger story that Ronald Reagan would cop to, or that all the other people who've won this Horatio Alger Prize that they give out every year, including the founder of a company with like multiple OSHA infractions, Ronald Wennick. So I just think, I'm not a founder, whatever, currently running it. I think that is something we need to look at, like this, that this story, first of all, isn't the story that we think, because it's really about romantically charged upper class people helping working class young people. And it's written by somebody who, in fact, had those same desires and wishes in their own life. At best, the Horatio Alger story is like a homosocial one, and at worst, something else. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I like how you're exposing
who, of course, through a proxy, got Social Security and Medicare at the end of her life when she was quite ill. And it's interesting when you read off the Ayn Rand supporters, because they'll be like, but that's okay because you pay into that. Like they'll suddenly start talking about how these are not entitlements, partially because they want to justify their leaders' last acts. But like, I think we can agree this is somebody who says that power is completely independent of others, and we have to survive on our own, and whose novels are filled with characters that destroy anybody weak. And meanwhile, she's applying for Social Security and Medicare.
And that has to do with what you're calling rich fictions that we believe in. These delusional fables about bootstrapping, and you make a really good analysis about how Americans are duped by this. They kind of underestimate the disparities in income and class. I think you cite Piketty.
Yeah, 60% of wealth is inherited, like serious wealth, that is. I think that we need to keep remembering that number. And it was the same number in the Fortune 400 list,
right.
So it's kind of like across the spectrum of data and in the US. So I just think we need to think about that. And the rich fiction idea occurred to me partially because I was like, people are constantly saying that the poor are undeserving of the aid and care that we need to provide for our citizens, but they also think that the rich are deserving. And so there's a twin myth that we need to sort of go after at the same time,
This reminds me a lot of some work that a co-author of mine, Alfonso Monturi, and I were working on back in the 90s on creativity, on genius. And we were kind of like peeling back the onions about the research on genius, that it was a myth, the myth of the lone genius.
Oh God. This is my second book was about this.
Oh, yeah, the myth of the
It was
lone
called
entrepreneur,
Hot House Kids.
Huh,
And it
I
was
didn't know
about
that.
construction of genius at Prodigy and the giftedness industry and all this kind of stuff.
Hot
Yeah.
House
So,
Kids.
yeah.
Yeah, we were looking at the myth of single-handedly, heroically, against all odds, with no help from the environment or spouses or colleagues, But it's similar to what you're talking about with Bezos and Musk and Zuckerberg, and somehow they just catapulted themselves to this insane wealth all on their own.
Mhm.
And the pandemic really pulled the curtains on this and really exposed this vulgar inequality during the pandemic, right? With these yachts that were floating and high-end real estate agents that were getting calls for remote islands or something.
Yeah, and obviously outer space. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think, in going to New Zealand and then suddenly, and whatever, even in my own life, people are like in Bridgehampton. I'm like, what? And do I have to see this? I want to unsee your swimming pool right now. So yeah, that was a real it was pretty intense, and I think this is definitely pandemically informed, this book, because
Yes.
I was writing a lot of the most lyrical parts, right, when you couldn't really report um uh, during the pandemic, and I was just struck by this gap and how bodily it is, like some people in states of extreme relaxation who don't no longer have to go into the office and no longer have to or maybe just like living on purely on income, and then living on like whatever assets. Then you have people who are risking their lives, who have to be curbside delivery, as one of EHRP's contributors had to be. Like,
Mm.
that's a person.
You also say it's not just rich white men, but also this whole idea of the girl boss hype.
Yeah, the girl boss was at one point I devoted a whole chapter to it, but I felt like, I felt like that sort of, it was part of the whole misogyny to single out the girl boss as the bad actors, because if anything, I felt like they'd internalized this masculinist tropes, and then they
Mhm.
often, during the pandemic, exactly, you had CEOs earning 399 times their employees' wages. You had them all being taken down. That was sort of telling. They're the easiest overclass to get out with the pitchforks because they are women, right? But
Mm.
I mean, they deserve it probably. But so I was like, I'm not going to write a whole chapter on them. But yeah, the girl boss was another one of these. Sheryl Sandberg is one of my favorite targets for this. Talk about, this is a perfect mindful crank target, right? Like, I continue to be alarmed, not just at how we as women fail to put ourselves forward, but also at how we fail to notice and correct for this gap. It's like, it's really always put back on the women.
You have to fit in. You have to accommodate.
Or this other one, Rachel Hollis. I absolutely refuse to watch you wallow. She writes in "Girl, wash your face," which sounds kind of accusatory. Do not wallow. But yeah, they were really exposed at some point during the pandemic, partially for how they treated employees of color, some of these girl bosses, and how they treated low-paid employees in general.
I think there was a counter book called Lean Out.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I like that. Yeah.
So is this what trickle down feminism is? It's related to that?
Yeah, and I think somebody calls it the feminist fallacy. It's like, you see these women in their beautiful offices, and Jake, there's weddings that are designed by the designer of J. Crew, and it's like, again, it's this kind of whole aspirational living element. But then you peel it back, and often they too have had like a lot of benefits, right? That from the color of their skin to wealthy backgrounds to these kind of social networks. So like, yeah, it's like just asking anyone to lean in is probably going to end in trouble, unless it's leaning into a union. So yeah.
Well, I liked how you traveled out to America's heartland and up to Wisconsin. And I used to live in Wisconsin for a short period of time.
For that particular chapter, because I was writing that during the pandemic.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. But you
And
did
Zoom
manage
and
to talk to a dairy farmer.
Yeah, a lot of people actually out there. Yeah, and I wanted to give a sense of why people who voted for Trump, who thought he was self-made, what they were thinking, and also, how much a lot of the lack of the social net had affected them too. So it's like, I think to have, I don't mean to be like both sides about this, but I do think this guy is a serious Trump supporter, and he's been dealing with, a lot of economic challenges in dairy farming, and I think that it's connected, right? It's not his his passion for this person he thinks is self-made, who's going to save him, is coming from this sense of feeling vulnerable and at risk that for other people might make them go in a different direction. But I wanted to get at the complexity of that.
But when they're informed about Trump's inherited wealth, I mean, does it make any difference in their?
Well, yeah, it really did actually. There was a study that was done by these academics that I found completely fascinating. The researchers asked voters, and this was in the Midwest, to what extent were you aware that Donald Trump grew up the son of a wealthy real estate businessman, friend Trump, that he had millions of dollars of loans from his father? And many didn't know. They didn't know he was raised in great wealth. I mean, you might find that hard to imagine, but just again, recognize that this is the product of places in this country where local newspapers have closed, where they're watching Fox, and at least then we're probably reading Breitbart, and if they're reading it all, right? And they don't really understand that they're getting this spoon-fed idea just from Trump's own lips that he made this money himself. And when they were informed of this, they were much less likely to vote for him.
Hmm.
And I found that completely interesting. And to me, I felt like it should be watchwords, honestly, that instead of ads leaning into a Horatio Alger story, that if anything, they should be countering people's self-made story and showing their seams. And like, I think we've seen some of this with Fetterman, exposing his mental health. Richie Torres has been doing that, but also people like Maxwell Alejandro Frost saying he can't afford an apartment in DC. AOC said that too. People saying that they make $40,000. You know what I mean? I think that this is actually a strength that could be amplified, and that exposing people who claim to be self-made and Republican voters who then, go towards them, that actually is a potential direction we should be taking rhetorically about exposing people who say they're self-made. So, yeah.
And then you actually got into a little bit of McMindfulness territory in your book.
Yeah, that's how I met you.
Yeah, we met in New York before COVID. I think it was in late November, early December 2019.
Yeah, and I had just started the book. Most of the book, that's the thing. I think I had conducted 10 interviews in person or something, and then it was like, but yeah.
One of the things that I discovered from this chapter is that just how profoundly unhappy American workers are. I mean, I knew that it was bad, but I didn't think it was that bad.
Yeah. Well, with the mindfulness chapter, I think I was going towards this thing that I write about later too, which is that we need to have therapy and care that's supported in this country, that's not supported by corporations that are simply interested in people's productivity. And that, when you read the arguments for corporate mindfulness, and you could do this better than I could, but they often talk about $3,000 more productive.
Yes.
And you're like, well, this is a really dark way to think about people's mental health.
On the surface of the bottom line, and that's how it's sold. That's for sure.
That's how it's sold, and then it leads to these Amazon coffin-like booths where people, maybe the porta potties would be better for the people who are doing the deliveries. That more useful coffin-like structure for them to enter. But anyway, but this was these booths where they're supposed to have this mindful experience. Amazon workers on the job, so I think this is what we don't need more of. Instead, I write in inequality therapy that we need to have peer-to-peer counseling. We need to have even a new deal for therapy. That's
because therapy culture has been focused on a very kind of privatized, interiorized view of the self, which is disconnected from its social, economic, political environment. And now we have this life coaching industry that's stepped in which, is kind of a pseudo-therapy that's being used, business life coaches and all that. They can't really say they're offering therapy because they don't have a license to do that. But they say, oh, these employees, they're languishing in their jobs. And they just need a boost in terms of a pep talk by a life coach. I think that this be all you can be sort of rhetoric that comes out of psychology, and you wrote about grit as well and resilience. These all are part of the same family of this ideology of neoliberal therapies in a way, neoliberal techniques.
Yeah. So grit and resilience. I mean, I think some kinds of resilience, like I write about this, like environmental resilience, like it's not first of all, grit, no. But resilience, like there's useful ways in which it's used. But, the therapeutic resilience, especially when it's applied to people who come from financially stressed environments or who've had ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, seems to me to be often pretty cruel. Like there's this expectation that it's to put it back on the individual and their capacity to survive rather than giving them the support, the various kinds of support they need in order to make that happen. So, yeah.
One way of thinking about this that comes to me right now is this, as we're talking about this, is that bootstrapping, it shows up in many different forms like positive psychology, but maybe this is like an American form of folk psychology. Is that, that nice. And these folk psychologies are informed by these cultural myths that you are exposing, and that's informing our collective visions of what society should look like, or how we should, policies, political policies.
And that's the part of the individualism that appeals to the kind of people we know, which would be like creativity and, all this kind of thing, and self-creation and along those lines, without always referring back to the social terms that make people who they are. I like that. I like the folk psychology thing. I think that's true. And I think it's also, people, want to give an account of why luck and randomness exists. And so some of this is sort of a basic human thing that has taken a certain form. Like, so for instance, like I write about Melvin Lerner, whose concept of just world theory was that it was based on experiments he did. And this is like right in the 60s, everyone was electrocuting subjects and having people watch behind glass. I don't know what
that was that was very trendy back then.
But what was that about? Like, I don't know. Anyway, like what was that? Why was that particular? It's sort of like, it seems like from the era of like B movies where there were like, blobs and things, like Tingler. There's kind of like late modernist sensory experience. So, but anyway, so all the people were watching this woman suffer. If they're not suffering, they must have done something right. So that's his entire theory, the just world hypothesis. I actually tried to get in touch with him. I've tried many times, but I think he's quite old. Last time I checked, he was still alive, but he's pretty amazing. He did this for like 25 years, these studies.
Yeah, it reminds me of a cognitive bias or some sort of logical fallacy of some kind.
Yeah.
And you write, I think you said the subtitle of his book was A Fundamental Delusion.
Yeah. I mean, he was great. I loved to read this stuff. I mean, the material was remarkable. And I mean, I think part of what I liked writing this book was just, I studied lit and sociology and things. And I just really love reading this older work that gives different lenses on both the myth and the critique of the myth, and just like looking at the accounts and how they were different, depending what time in history they were slightly different. But I mean, if we're thinking folk psychology, there's a remarkable consistency also, right, between the young women watching this woman suffer behind glass and the people who believe in the Horatio Alger story, even though it's wrong. And the
coming out by that title, Self-Made.
Oh yeah, I saw that. I think it's more like tech, but sort of like oriented around identities and so on social media and stuff. That
really Tara Isabella Burton. I think it's From Mona Lisa to the Kardashians. It's the subtitle. Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about the side hustle. That when I think about the gig economy, and I guess now it's morphed into this idea of the side hustle. But isn't it what we used to call part-time jobs?
Yeah, exactly. Or worse, like, yeah, worse, like after school. But I sort of like spent a lot of time watching these videos, these grind set, very bro-y grind set videos. I don't know if you know the term grind set. So they call it
No,
mindset grind set.
no, never heard
So
of
they're
it.
like, yeah, so they're like, you can, because the idea you
Oh,
grind, you work and
yeah.
you work and you work, the grind set. So
Sounds
that's the
like grit.
sensibility. Yeah, it is. But it's
Yeah.
like some guy drinking, a protein shake and holding
Okay.
up his book that says, best fixes to survive and,
There's
make
a lot
it,
of that on
whatever.
YouTube. Yeah, yeah.
A lot of it. And like, abs of steel while you're selling your CBD out of your car and become like a millionaire. I don't know. Like these, again, like the folk psychology part of it, right?
Yeah, and you tell a story about a woman, I believe, who was an Instacart
Hmm.
shopper who lived in
Hmm.
Silicon Valley
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and in the backyard of her grandmother's house, making
Hmm.
28,000 a year with her husband.
Yeah. And she actually
But she
always
liked it.
says she likes it. Like that's part
Yeah,
I don't want to just get. I
yeah,
mean, I'm very interested in reporting on actual people as
yeah.
well, and there's a
On the ground.
tendency.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and there's this sort of tendency to try to find the model subject, like the person who's incredibly distressed about their gig work job, or the person who, the farmer who is like wildly bigoted and unlikable, right? But
Right,
I think just the opposite's important for good reporting, that you find the person whose bio doesn't, or what they say, how their affect doesn't quite line up with what you'd want as the perfect subject, because then you and your readers are then forced to have a more complicated view of it. And yeah, at the same time, like if the argument's good enough, the argument will win out in a sense, but that there'll be complexity around it. So,
well, I think the point of your chapter, though, underlying all the stories, is that somehow the capitalists have sold us just how glamorous it is to
mhm.
have these side hustles, or right,
Yeah,
or gig to be a gig worker.
yeah. And
Yeah,
the etymology of hustle, like it comes from hip hop culture, and the whole vocabulary around this kind of work. I was just saying grind set, but a lot of it's like nimble, robust, like it's
oh,
very physical,
yeah,
flexible. Like there's a great
right.
book by Emily Martin, who's an anthropologist, called Flexible Labor. I think it's Flexible Labor, Flexible Bodies. That was about flexibility and labor. That was the
The metaphors of that,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And
yeah.
the metaphors are all about like I almost kind of like
You can adapt.
techno
You can, right,
dancing in like a techno club or something. Like you're hustling, you're flexible, um you can adapt, and again putting it back on the individual subject and their body to survive this economy and
and
these labor conditions.
and at the same time during the pandemic, we were all using DoorDash and things like that. But it's just astounding that Instacart's valuation, just how it skyrocketed to what
Hmm.
$39 billion or
Yeah, yeah,
something
yeah, exactly.
crazy.
And they
It's
were still clawing back some of the hazard protections, and that's why there's all this new union activity. You know,
right. Amazon, Starbucks.
REI.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I really liked how you brought in Peter Kropotkin, the
Oh,
Russian.
yes.
Uh,
My I became obsessed with I think Petra. I mean, my husband speaks Russian. Petra Kropotkin. I don't know. I just like became completely obsessed with that book, by his biography. Like Oscar Wilde wrote about him. I was like, wow. I didn't know. So yeah.
yeah, there was an American, Murray Bookchin, who I read his work too. He's like a New Englander who was into mutual aid. But is this mutual aid is a term being thrown around? It's an older concept, as you point out. But is it a cliche, or is it a real social movement now? Do you think?
Um, it's a real social movement. I mean, I think it has become. I mean, I think during the pandemic it was huge, right? So I started reporting my book during the pandemic, and I talked to a bunch of different people who were doing organizing around, like, oh, I don't know, maybe 10 people were doing organizing around mutual aids, and it was like there were 800 thousands, and they were all on this hub. Everyone had Google lists and Google chats, and it's hard. Some of them, you go to their sites and they're like now no longer extant. And yeah, there's this fear within me that like, oh no, this only existed in a state of disaster. But then again, what was interesting is I saw that a lot of the people I mentioned, a lot of people I talked to, they had gone on to have political careers or they were aspiring politicians. So I think mutual aid was, if anything, was kind of like a hotbed for political activity as well. So even if some of them don't exist anymore, the impulse and the training has created new people. It's sort of like a great society kind of moment in that way. Like there's a new book by Sarah Matthew Tompkin she was a mutual aid, ran a mutual aid, and now she wrote a novel about it that's gotten a lot of attention, nominated for Booker, I think, and like, that kind of stuff. Like I feel like there's people who've been sort of created in part by this mutual aid movement during the pandemic, whose careers have started, whose activism started. The fridges still exist too. I mean, in my neighborhood, sometimes I do this. I go to the fridges and bring canned goods to the fridges.
So when you were studying Kropotkin, I think you mentioned we've been sort of fed a distorted version of Darwinism, the nature red in tooth and claw kind of imagery.
Yeah.
That reminded me how we've selectively have understood Adam Smith's philosophy.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is that like, I started to read the descendants of the social Darwinists, right? Huxley and there's others, and they were all like kind of upper class English guys.
Of course.
Let's use this. And to survival of the fittest. But there was this other strand, socialist Darwinism. That's even David Graeber wrote about this relatively recently, where Darwin wrote about mutual sympathy. He wrote about polyps working in concert, and bugs on the bird's back, and the plants and the milkweed and the
symbiosis,
mistletoe, which is like a parasite, and how it like surrounds trees, symbiosis, and that was one of the crucial parts of natural life, of evolution, of human life too, and animal life. And so I feel like there's like a pretty substantial biological account for mutualism. And Kropotkin was very influenced by Darwin, like directly influenced. So it's like, I feel like this is a history that needs to be reinstated or people reminded about.
It seems like we have a knack for marginalizing those more social lenses, communitarian.
But this is actually behavioral, biological, like you're even good at marginalizing the social readings of things that are more materialist, right? So I think that's
yeah. I mean, look at the environmental sciences. This is fundamental to this idea of interdependence within an ecosystem. I mean, that's how ecosystems flourish. It's biologically well established.
Whatever the mushroom psyllium or whatever, and I'm going to mispronounce it. The sort of the mushroom and the trees and the whole Suzanne Simard thing. The trees are not crowding each other out for light as we were taught when we were 10 years old, but instead they're a community that with an understory that communicates to each other, right? So I think that to me that's really helpful for thinking about the sort of naturalness of the collective endeavor and the naturalness of going toward a different American dream.
And you bring up the importance of alternatives to capitalist enterprises, these worker-owned cooperatives. And when I was in graduate school, we were studying the Mondragon, the Spanish Basque country. It was huge worker cooperative in the Basque country of Spain. But you found a drivers cooperative that was an alternative to Uber, right in New York City.
Yeah, and I interviewed a lot of these people, like people who were running like a workers cooperative in Chicago for formerly incarcerated people. All the worker owners were formerly incarcerated, and they were serving food and kind of catering company style, or a pizza cooperative near you, I think, like one's in San Jose, and then they had two stations of it, and again, the workers were owners as well. Supposedly, the pizza is very good. Maybe when I go out there, we should go have a slice. Actually, can we do that?
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And And I like how, like you said, you were digging into history and you discovered it wasn't just the hippies that discovered these co-op movements. It was traced back to W.E.B. Du Bois, right?
Hmm. Yeah, Du
That
Bois wrote extensively about co-ops and actually mutual aid, and that they were helpful to women and people of color. And that's part of why we don't hear about that history as much. And people who couldn't get a bank loan to start a business, let's say, like Black Americans in certain communities, or people who weren't going to be able to get support, like create, whatever, get startup capital for a business. So I thought that was actually really amazing finding. And, many of them were around food production, but sometimes there are other things too, other kinds of cooperative enterprises.
back in the 1990s, I was an action researcher. I did a lot of kind of community development. I was involved in the participative democracy, workplace democracy movement. And, I remember reading a lot of, or I was really a fan of Amita Etzione's work on communitarianism, the
I
social
don't even know
philosophy.
who you've got to. Maybe we should have a gloss for this. Like, what is? Wait, can you send me their name?
Yeah. But he had this idea of that it was like a shared conception of the common good. And
Hmm.
it really feels like your book is kind of, that's the arc of where this book is going.
Hmm.
And so that leads to this chapter that I really enjoyed too, is inequality therapy, because we were starting to talk about that therapy culture in America. There's been a lot of critiques of this, how therapy is complicit with a neoliberal ideology and all that. But at one time, there were community psychology clinics that were, and those are not around that
Oh
much.
my
I mean, I
god.
guess it's because the insurance industry
Yeah.
have probably wiped them out. But this term, trauma informed therapy or trauma informed, has become very trendy. And I want to ask you, how is that different from conventional therapy? And
Well, I think trauma informed, when it's good,
when it's good, yeah.
when it's good, it recognizes that people have potentially, well, they've experienced social trauma, that be it like abuse or economic injustice or race-based trauma, right? Or if they're vets, they've experienced warfare, and that there's a kind of moral injury too that's involved in this, where people haven't been necessarily able to respond to those traumatic forces in their lives. And that if we just keep going back to, like, what did your mother do, what did your father do, that,
To behavioral therapy,
or show resilience,
yeah.
that's not really enough, that we have to, recognize the trauma is separate from the person. So to me, that's the best part of trauma informed. So I think it probably means other stuff at this point, because it's like, it's kind of hilarious. When I started looking at who calls themselves trauma informed, there's like trauma informed
Yeah,
prisons. It's like, okay,
yeah.
let's see if that's actually ever happened. But yeah,
Well, it's class-based therapy too, in a way, because
yeah,
you're
yeah,
recognizing that explicitly.
yeah, yeah. So
And
that, I mean, when it's good, again, it
yeah,
does recognize that, and it's political in that way, because so I talked to someone they call themselves a critical therapist, and I thought it was
mhm.
really fascinating. They ask people to pay what they can, so it's sort of like but that could mean the wealthy person's paying a huge amount to support the people who can't pay. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and that a lot of the therapy is around money and class and
But a lot of notions such as codependency is seen through this neoliberal lens,
mhm,
right? I
exactly.
mean,
I mean,
uh,
my joke is always what you call codependent, I call love. I don't know, but I thought it may be good to like mug. But
but there is a
yeah, I
class
think,
bias among many
yeah,
therapists that you
of
discovered too.
course,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
also, like, what woman who is a victim of domestic violence who makes 82 cents, it's down from 83 cents on a dollar, um, is going to feel incredibly comfortable leaving their partner, like that. That has to be part of how we're reading leaving a DV situation, um, leaving any abusive situation, that it's often economic.
Well, congratulations on your New York Times op-ed, guest
Oh,
op-ed.
thank
What
you.
was the title again? We'll have a link to it.
Oh, it was, I forget, it wasn't mine. It was something like,
Yeah, the editor always
can
chooses.
can we forget the worst American myth or something like that? The one I really liked was America declare dependence, but I think that was an early, they changed them. I thought America declare dependence was kind of awesome.
I would have chose something like in praise of dependency.
Yeah, I think I did. That was mine. It was actually
okay.
like, yeah. But I felt like, so it was, what I was happy about with that was, I mean, I try to soften it. Sometimes I'd be like, interdependence. No, I'm just, and the editor agreed. They're like, yeah, just go for dependence, because the shock element, which of course, if you look at the comments, there's something like 1,000 and they're all like, that's, some of them are like, this is exactly what I needed to hear. Sublime. And then some of them are like, this is another namby-pamby, cancel culture, liberal,
right.
extolling weakness, but that's just the point. Let's take back, like I even said, dependence pride. Let's take back dependence as something that is not terrible, and maybe weakness is not terrible. I think that this is the framing problems again that we've experienced with the framing of strength, when a strength is purely nominalist, inherited, fictional, and weakness when it's also kind of a set of social constructions that would make us see it as weakness.
Well, yeah, I think that the importance of new language, as you're pointing out, and new metaphors, new forms of storytelling. What about seeing wellness? Like, wellness is a big concept too. Well-being, wellness. Redefining that as fairness. We never talk about fairness and wellness in the same sentence.
Well, there's a subject of my book who came from a very financially stressed, very poor background. She said, it was very beautiful in that inequality chapter at the end. She says, what other people call resilience, I call well-resourced. So that is, part of what you're saying. It's not just fairness. It's like, the opposite's true too. If you're saying somebody's gritty, you're probably some level saying they're well-resourced. You may not be acknowledging it.
So we should move from self-help to us-help, or we help.
I call it radical self-help.
Radical self-help.
And the radical part is when you see the structural and systemic forces laid against you, you can stop blaming yourself. And that, to me, that's self-help.
And then kind of seeing through this contempt that we have for the poor, right?
For anybody vulnerable,
Anybody vulnerable,
or anyone who's willing to expose themselves as that. One of the things I start with the book with all the sort of emails I get as somebody who runs a poverty nonprofit, and 37% of our contributors define themselves as working class, working poor, lower income, right? And many of them, why did you do X or Y? Like, why did you go to college? Why didn't you? Like, they're trying to find the undeserving, poor part. Like, what had they done wrong? What to get the shocks? Like going back to Melvin Lerner to Just World. Like, why did they get the social shock? And they want to come up with a story that's self-protective of the person writing this criticism. Like, I won't get that. They got that because they did X.
They deserved
it. And it's always things like, why did you, not marry the father? You know what I mean? Like all that kind of blame and shame. And often the thing that I sort of, the most hilarious part is often they're like, we haven't been to a restaurant in 10 years. Well, your life's pretty depressing. It's like celebrating these pleasureless lives of restriction and restraint, right? Which probably aren't even true, but that, so I think giving in to our vulnerability, being able to share it, and also embracing collective joy, or what one theorist calls communal luxury, which is the kind of party-like atmosphere that can spring up with collectivity, because I really think it can. Barbara wrote about this too in Dancing in the Streets. So did Lynn Siegel, and they're both very influential to me about kind of political joy in a sense. Yeah.
Well, this has been great, and I really look forward to you coming out to San Francisco so we can get together again.
Yeah. And absolutely.
You're on a real media blitz book tour here.
Yeah. I'm going to LA after San Francisco now. So yes, I can. But I'll be in the Bay, and we can chat and maybe go get that pizza.
All right. Alissa Quart,
okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ron.
This is the Mindful Cranks podcast. I hope you like our new look and feel. And check out our webpage at www.mindfulcranks.com. And subscribe to the Cranks newsletter to learn about upcoming guests and other events. The Mindful Cranks is pretty much on every podcast platform. Please rate and review the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you are so inclined. That's it for now. I'll be back soon with another amazing guest. Thanks for listening.